They threw her away like garbage. A once loyal K9 German Shepherd, trained to serve and protect, now lay in the filth of a sewer tunnel, her body weak, her 5 newborn puppies shivering beside her. No one was coming for her. She had given everything, her strength, her loyalty, her trust. But in the end, they abandoned her in the worst way possible. As the dark waters rose and the hunger gnawed at her bones, she had only one thought. She had to save her babies. And just when it seemed like all hope was lost, something unbelievable happened. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring and emotional stories like this to you. The air was thick with the stench of rot and waste. In the darkness of the sewer tunnel, a faint whimper echoed against the cold, damp walls. The sound was barely a whisper over the slow-moving sludge that pooled beneath them. She couldn't move. Her body was too weak, her limbs too cold. Every muscle in her frame ached, her ribs pressing against her matted fur. The gash on her hind leg throbbed. A wound she barely remembered getting, but it wasn't the pain that kept her awake. It was them. 5 tiny bodies, curled against her stomach, their fragile forms trembling from hunger and cold. Her babies. She lowered her head, nuzzling them gently. They were so small, so helpless, their whimpers sent sharp pangs of urgency through her. They needed food. They needed to get out of here. But how? The last thing she remembered was being dragged, thrown into the open sewer entrance like she was nothing. The stench of the human who had betrayed her still burned in her nose. She had fought. She had screamed for her handler. But no one came. Now, she lay half submerged in filth, her puppies clinging to her for warmth. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, but there was no way out. And worst of all, the water was rising. A low growl rumbled in her throat. She had to move. Summoning what little strength she had left, she forced herself up, her legs wobbling beneath her. She lifted one pup by the scruff, placing him on a dry ledge near the tunnel wall. Then another. And another. Her body screamed in protest, her vision blurring. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. By the time she placed the last puppy on the ledge, her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed, gasping, her head spinning. And that's when she heard it. A sound above her. Footsteps. A voice. She lifted her head, her ears twitching. Someone was up there. She tried to bark, but all that came out was a weak, rasping whimper. Then, a splash. Something, or someone, had entered the sewer. Hope sparked in her chest. Was it them? Had they come back for her? Or was this just another nightmare? The cold, filthy water lapped against her legs as she struggled to keep her head up. She couldn't afford to collapse. Not yet. The sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnel above, heavy boots splashing against the sludge-covered ground. The scent of something unfamiliar, yet distinctly human, filled the air. She let out a weak, hoarse whimper. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Her heart pounded. Had they heard her? She tried again, forcing out a sound that barely resembled a bark. It hurt. Everything hurt. But she had to get their attention. Then, a voice. Low, cautious. Male. Hello? Her ears twitched. More splashing. They were getting closer. She forced her body up, staggering forward, pressing herself against the tunnel wall near her puppies. She had to protect them. A beam of light cut through the darkness. She winced, instinctively flinching at the sudden brightness. A flashlight. The human had a flashlight. Then she saw him. A man stood just a few feet away, his boots partially submerged in the sewer water. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with short dark hair and stubble covering his face. His clothes were worn, stained with dirt. Not a threat. His eyes locked onto hers, and then flicked down to the tiny trembling bodies behind her. He inhaled sharply. "Oh my God," she growled weakly, warning him to stay back, but she was too weak to be threatening. He crouched, keeping his distance, his expression shifting from shock to something softer. "Easy, girl. I'm not here to hurt you." His voice was low, careful. She didn't trust him. She couldn't. But what choice did she have? The water was still rising. She turned her head toward her pups, nudging one closer with her nose. The smallest one, barely breathing, barely moving. The man saw. His brows furrowed. "Jesus." His gaze flicked back to her, scanning the wounds on her body. "How long have you been down here?" She didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone, gentle, concerned. Something her old handler had once had, before they threw her away. The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked around, then back at her. "I can't leave you here." She stiffened. Then he moved. Slowly, carefully, he unzipped his jacket, pulling it off. He held it out, inching closer. "Let me help you." She let out a soft growl. Not a warning, a hesitation. His eyes softened. "I know you're scared, but you're running out of time." She glanced down at her pups. So were they. Her body swayed, exhaustion hitting her in waves. She had no fight left. The man must have sensed it, because in the next second, he reached for the first puppy. She snapped weakly, but he didn't flinch. He only scooped up the tiny body, wrapping it carefully in his jacket. Then another, and another. He was careful, gentle, not like the others. By the time he reached for the last pup, her head had slumped against the wall. The world swayed around her. A hand touched her side. Warm, steady. "I've got you," he murmured. She didn't fight. As darkness closed in, she let the stranger lift her from the filth, her body finally giving in. For the first time in days, she let someone carry her. She just hoped he wouldn't betray her, too. The world drifted in and out of focus. She was floating. No, she was being carried. The warmth of human arms replaced the cold, filthy water that had soaked into her fur for days. She barely registered the movement, barely understood what was happening. But one thing kept pulling her back from the darkness. Her puppies. She forced her eyes open. The dim tunnel lights blurred above her, and the scent of sewer waste still clung to her nose. But there was something else now. Something fresh. The smell of clean fabric, of warmth, of safety. The man holding her moved quickly but carefully. She could feel his steady breath, the way his grip was firm yet gentle. She wanted to fight, wanted to struggle. But her body refused. She had nothing left to give. They emerged into the night. Cool air swept over her damp fur, making her shiver. The man held her tighter. "Hang in there, girl," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Her head lolled to the side. And then, a cry, soft, weak. Her ears twitched. Her puppies. She forced herself to turn her head slightly, her vision swimming. The jacket wrapped around them was stained and damp, but she could see the tiny movements inside, the faintest signs of life. But one wasn't moving, the smallest one. A sharp pain shot through her chest, a different kind of pain. The man must have noticed too, because he quickened his pace, his arms tightening around her. "Stay with me," he muttered. "All of you." She didn't remember when they reached the truck. All she knew was the feeling of being lowered onto something soft, the floor of the vehicle lined with an old blanket. The man unwrapped his jacket, carefully placing the puppies next to her. She immediately nudged them with her nose, her heart pounding. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth wasn't moving. Her body tensed. No, 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 no. She licked his tiny face, desperate, nudging him again. Nothing. Her breathing grew rapid. The man crouched beside her. "Come on, little guy," he murmured. He reached out, his large hands too big, too rough compared to the fragile body of the pup. She growled, weak, but warning. The man hesitated. Then, his voice softened. "Trust me." She froze. The words shouldn't have meant anything, but they did. She had trusted before and been thrown away. But this human? He had pulled her from the dark. She swallowed her fear and let him touch her baby. He scooped the puppy into his hands, pressing the tiny body against his chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, he rubbed the pup's sides gently, murmuring under his breath. She didn't understand his words, but she understood his urgency. He wasn't giving up. And then, a cough. A tiny, gasping breath. Her pup moved. Her entire body sagged with relief. The man exhaled shakily, placing the puppy back beside her. "That's it, little guy. You're not done yet." She licked her baby, her heart pounding. He was weak, but he was alive. She lifted her head, looking at the man properly for the first time. His face was lined with exhaustion, his dark hair damp with sweat, but his eyes were kind, not like the others, not like the one who had thrown her away. She didn't trust easily, but tonight she had no choice. She dropped her head onto the blanket, her body curling protectively around her pups. And for the first time in days, she closed her eyes, no longer afraid of what would happen next. She had a chance. The low hum of the truck's engine vibrated beneath her as it rumbled down the road. The scent of the sewer still clung to her fur, but for the first time in days, the air around her was warm and safe. Her eyes fluttered open, her body still curled around her puppies. She nudged them gently, checking. All 5 were still breathing. Weak, but alive. A soft exhale came from the front seat. She lifted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto the man. He was gripping the wheel tightly, his eyes flicking between the dark road and the rearview mirror. His jaw was tense, his expression unreadable, but she could feel it. Something was wrong. The truck slowed. She stiffened. He glanced back at her. "It's okay, girl. Just a little longer." She didn't understand the words, but his tone was steady, reassuring. Still, her instincts told her otherwise. Then, bright lights. A second vehicle appeared behind them, its headlights blinding in the mirror. The man cursed under his breath. His grip on the wheel tightened. The other car was following them. She didn't know who it was, but he did. The truck pulled into a dirt driveway, stopping in front of a small house. The second vehicle slowed, idling at a distance. The man sat still for a moment, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. His eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror, then back at her. "It's him, isn't it?" he muttered. She let out a low growl. He sighed, rubbing his face. "All right, let's get you inside." He pushed open the door and moved quickly to the back, lifting the puppies first, placing them carefully inside the house before returning for her. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. "Whoa, easy." He crouched beside her, his hands hovering over her side. She flinched, expecting roughness, but his touch was gentle. She let him scoop her up, carrying her through the door just as the second vehicle's engine cut off. Her breathing shallowed. Was it him? The one who had left her for dead? Her body tensed in his arms. The man must have felt it because he whispered, "I won't let anyone take you." She believed him. For the first time in her life, she believed a human's promise, and she prayed he could keep it. The house was small but warm, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly herbal. The man carefully set her down on a pile of soft blankets in the corner of the room. She immediately curled around her puppies, her body tense, ears perked. Outside, the second car's engine had cut off. Silence. She could feel her heartbeat pounding against her ribs. Was it him? The man, her rescuer, stood near the window, his back rigid as he watched the vehicle through the curtain. Whoever it was hadn't come out yet. He muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Then, after a moment of hesitation, he turned back to her. His eyes softened. "Stay here." She didn't understand the words, but she understood his intention. He was going outside, and she didn't like it. The front door creaked open, letting in the cool night air. She tried to lift her head, but exhaustion weighed her down. She listened. 2 voices. One was her rescuer, steady but laced with frustration. The other? Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice. It was him. The man who had once owned her. The one who had trained her, commanded her, earned her trust, only to throw her away like garbage. Her handler. She barely had the strength to move, but something primal ignited inside her. She wanted to fight, wanted to show him that she wasn't dead, that she wasn't done. But she could barely lift her head. All she could do was listen. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Her rescuer's voice was sharp. A scoff. "Didn't think you'd be stealing dogs from me either. She's not yours anymore. She was never mine to begin with." The man, her former handler, grumbled. "She was property. She got old, slower, not useful anymore." A pause. Then her rescuer spoke, his voice dangerously low. "So, you dumped her in the sewers to die." Silence. A beat. Then, a chuckle. Her body stiffened. The man who had betrayed her was laughing. "Listen, man, it's just a dog." Just a dog. The words echoed in her skull. She had served him, protected him, trusted him. And to him, she had never meant anything. The growl rumbled from deep in her chest before she could stop it. Footsteps. The front door opened again, and her rescuer walked back in, alone. He ran a hand through his hair, muttering curses under his breath. He crouched beside her, looking exhausted, angry. "He's gone." She didn't believe him. He must have seen the doubt in her eyes, because he sighed, rubbing his face. "For now?" She let out a soft whimper. The man looked at her for a long time, his expression shifting from frustration to something else, something she had never seen in a human before. Real care. He reached out, hesitating only for a second before his fingers brushed her head, carefully avoiding her wounds. "I don't know what they did to you," he murmured, "but you're not just a dog." She blinked slowly, her body finally relaxing under his touch. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she had finally found someone who saw her for what she really was. Family? The night stretched on in silence. The house was still, but her body refused to rest. She couldn't stop listening, couldn't stop expecting the worst. She had spent too long being disposable, too long knowing that at any moment she could be abandoned again. Her rescuer sat in the armchair across the room, watching her. He hadn't spoken in a while. Maybe he could sense it. Her unease, her fear, the way her ears kept flicking toward every creak and shift outside. He sighed, rubbing his hands together. "I don't know what I'm going to do with you." She didn't understand the words, but she knew the tone. He wasn't talking to himself. He was talking to her. Her head lifted slightly. "You don't trust me yet," he murmured, more to himself than anything. "I get it." She blinked. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But I'm not him." Her chest tightened. Him. The handler who had thrown her away. The handler who had left her to die. She lowered her head, pressing her nose against her puppies. They were her only certainty. The man sighed again, running a hand through his hair. "You need rest," he muttered. "And food. And a bath." His lips twitched slightly, almost like he was amused at his own list. Then he stood and disappeared into another room. She forced her body up, muscles screaming in protest. She needed to be ready, ready to run, ready to fight, ready for when he changed his mind. Then she heard it, the sound of a can popping open. She froze. A smell hit her nose. Meat, real meat. Her stomach clenched painfully. It had been so long since she had eaten anything but filth. Her rescuer returned, a small plate in his hands. He crouched a few feet away, setting it on the floor. "I don't know what you used to eat," he said, "but this is all I've got for now." She stared at him. She stared at the food. It was so close. But what if it was a trick? What if he was just waiting for her to let her guard down? The man seemed to understand her hesitation. He scooted back slightly, giving her space. "I won't touch you." Something about the way he said it, calm, patient, made her body loosen just a little. Her puppies stirred beside her, their tiny whimpers pulling her focus back to reality. She had to eat. For them. She moved slowly, stepping toward the food. She expected him to reach out, to try to grab her. He didn't. He just watched. She took one bite, then another. The food was gone before she even realized she had eaten it all. She licked her lips, her body humming with gratitude and hesitation. The man nodded to himself. "Good girl." Her ears flicked. She hadn't heard those words in so long. Not since she had been useful. Not since she had belonged to someone. He stood and stretched. "We'll figure things out in the morning." She didn't move. She didn't know what to do. She had never been given a choice before. The man turned off the light and walked to the other side of the room, laying down on an old couch. She watched him, her breathing slow and careful. Would he still be here in the morning? Would he wake up and regret saving her? Would she wake up and be alone again? She curled back around her puppies, closing her eyes. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe it was a second chance. The morning light crept through the windows, casting a soft glow across the small house. The warmth of the rising sun replaced the bitter cold of the sewer. But the German Shepherd still lay awake, her body tense. She hadn't slept much. Every noise, every shift of the wind, every creak of the wooden floor kept her on edge. She was waiting for something to go wrong, for the door to open, for the man to tell her to leave, for everything to be taken away again. But nothing happened. The man still slept on the couch, his breathing steady, his chest rising and falling in slow, even movements. He was still here. She turned her head slightly, nudging one of her puppies with her nose. They were warm, curled against her, their tiny bodies pressing into her fur, still breathing, still alive. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something close to peace. Then, a sound. A car engine in the distance. Her body stiffened immediately, ears perking. She knew that sound. She rose to her feet, ignoring the soreness in her muscles, ignoring the way her legs trembled beneath her. She had to be ready. The man stirred at the noise, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "What is it, girl?" She didn't take her eyes off the door. She knew. He was back. The man sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Of course," he muttered. He stood, stretching before moving to the window. She watched as he peered outside. His jaw tightened. Then he looked at her. "It's him." She already knew. A deep growl rumbled in her throat. Her rescuer shook his head, rubbing his face. "I told him to leave you alone." But she knew men like her old handler didn't give up easily. The knock on the door was sharp, loud. "Open up!" Her muscles coiled, but the man placed a hand up. "Stay." She didn't like that word, didn't like waiting, didn't like being helpless. He took a breath before opening the door just enough to step outside. She could hear their voices, low but tense. She's my dog. She's not yours anymore. She's government property. She's a living thing, not a piece of equipment. A bitter chuckle. What do you care? You gonna keep her? You don't even know what she is? A long pause. Then, the words that made her heart stop. She's family now. Family. She had never had a home, never had family, only orders, commands, a life of serving, of giving, until she had nothing left. And now, someone was fighting for her. The voices outside grew more heated, but she wasn't listening anymore. She was moving. She ignored the stiffness in her legs, ignored the sharp pain in her ribs, ignored everything except the door. And then, she was outside. Her old handler's head snapped toward her. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. There's my girl. But she wasn't his girl anymore. She bared her teeth, a deep, threatening growl rising from her throat. She wasn't weak, wasn't disposable, wasn't his. The man beside her didn't stop her. He didn't need to. Her old handler took a step back. For the first time, he was the one afraid. His smirk faltered. Fine. He raised his hands. Keep your damn dog. He turned, walking away, muttering under his breath as he got into his car. The sound of the engine faded into the distance. She didn't move until she was sure he was gone. Then, finally, she exhaled. A hand brushed against her back, slow, careful. You okay? She turned, meeting her rescuer's gaze. His expression was calm, soft. Not like the handler before him, not like the ones who had thrown her away. She licked his hand once, just once. A silent thank you. He smiled. Let's go inside. And this time, she followed him without hesitation. She had finally found it. A home. A family. And she would never let anyone take it away again. This story is a raw, emotional journey of betrayal, survival, and redemption, told through the eyes of a discarded canine German Shepherd. It grips the audience from the first moment, throwing them into the depths of darkness, both literal and emotional. The opening is brutal. She isn't just abandoned. She is thrown away like trash, left to drown in filth with her newborn puppies. The pain isn't just physical. It's the emotional weight of realizing she was never truly loved, never truly valued. She was used, and when she was no longer useful, she was discarded. Yet, despite her suffering, she fights. The mother inside her refuses to let go, even as her body fails. Her only thought is survival, not for herself, but for her pups. Her exhaustion is crushing, but she moves them, shields them, keeps them warm with whatever strength she has left. And just when it seems like she can't fight anymore, a voice in the darkness gives her one last chance. Her rescuer is unlike the man who betrayed her. Where her former handler saw her as nothing, this man sees her pain and decides she is worth saving. But her trust has been shattered. Every human she has ever known has either used her or thrown her away. When he carries her out of the sewer, she doesn't understand why. She waits for the moment he changes his mind, for the moment she is abandoned again. But he doesn't let go. He doesn't demand her trust, doesn't force himself into her space. Instead, he gives her something she has never had before: patience. The moment he revives her dying pup is a turning point. She could have fought him, could have resisted, but instead, she allows him to try. And when her pup takes a breath, life returning to his tiny body, something inside her shifts. This man, this stranger, chose to help, even when he didn't have to. It is the first crack in the wall she has built around herself. The first moment where fear begins to give way to something else, hope. But the past does not disappear so easily. The moment her former handler returns, the fear is back. His presence is a reminder that to him, she was never more than a tool. His voice is familiar, but now it only fills her with dread. He is the one who threw her away, the one who left her to die, and yet he still dares to claim ownership over her. And then he says it, the words that cut deeper than any wound. She's just a dog. Everything builds to this moment. The betrayal, the suffering, the desperate fight to survive. It all leads here. But this time, she isn't powerless. This time, she has someone who stands beside her. When her rescuer looks the man in the eyes and says, "She's family now," it is more than just words. It is a declaration, a promise that she will never be abandoned again. And for the first time in her life, she chooses to believe it. When she steps forward and growls, it is not out of fear. It is out of defiance. She is not weak, not disposable, not his. The man who once commanded her loyalty is now the one backing away, and just like that, he is gone. In the end, the most powerful moment is not the fight, not the escape from the sewer, not even the confrontation. It is the quiet moment after, when she looks at her rescuer, sees the patience in his eyes, and makes the choice she has never been allowed to make. She licks his hand, a simple, small act, but to her, it means everything. It means trust. It means she has finally found a home. This story is a testament to the resilience of those who are thrown away, the courage to fight for something better, and the undeniable power of kindness. It reminds us that not all scars are visible, and sometimes the most broken souls are the ones who need love the most. In the end, she is not just a survivor, she is family.